You are listening to the Pinax Report.
Pinax Report.
Pinax Report.
The Pinax Report.
Pinax Report.
Pinax Report.
Live only on Pinax TV.
Akwaba aha Pinax TV and Pinax Report so and Ushi. And there in some yensa aka and as a Ghana fu enyanima and there Ken Ofori Atta or Parliament Akwa present a 2023 budget meche Ghana kom mabosika Ghana kom mabosika yede metoto Ghana ni meche sika yede bebo ye ho meche 2023 yede bebo Ghana ama Ghana etumpono ende na Ken Ofori Atta oko Parliament na wakwa koda sasike na wakwa kopa ho entuma na sa Ghana fo beka ya na nsemu ensem ebeba ya a chese Ken Ofori Atta majority and minority ni krampo omo Parliament no omo cha ye papa yi onfa na dwuma entufu manasa na dan kwakufu ado onsa ka no isa ne se na dwuma enso ni Ghana ye breye pa ende ye sori atoto efu mu ende ensenkafo ese omo bre omo muton a emu didwa dwandifo aboso kanfo omo nyina omo tomu ni aguma chese omo chira omo breye pa da enti ende no ende na oko Parliament akwakoda friend say Ghana ko mo abo sika no akwakoda ne die na Ken Ofori Atta sa mo be kaya sa na bidin kan ka kire mo no
restless determination to turn around this economy. Mr. Speaker, in a few years the Black Stars will be playing their first game in the 2022 FIFA World Cup tournament in Qatar. It is clear that we stand united as a nation behind our Black Stars. A successful passage of the 2023 budget, a successful conclusion of negotiations with the IMF, and making Ghana's performance in Qatar 2022 the most successful. That is winning the cup not only for the country, but for any African side on the World Cup stage. Will I dare say bring this most challenging year to a very successful end. To this, Mr. Speaker, we pray, as the Bible says, behold how good and pleasant it is when God's people live together in unity, for there God commands the blessings. Mr. Speaker, events March 2022, the pervasive volatility of our world today, in the vision of President Akuffo to reset our economy through industrialization. Our resolve to reset the economy and restore macroeconomic stability. But to do so, we need the support of the people of Ghana and the cooperation and approval of this Parliament. Our goal now is to significantly enhance, significantly cut down the cost of running government, significantly expand local production, invest more to protect the poor and vulnerable, continue expanding access to good roads and technology, education and health for every Ghanaian everywhere in Ghana diaspora. Mr. Speaker, this budget is therefore anchored on a 7-point agenda aimed at restoring macroeconomic stability and accelerating our economic transformation as articulate in the post-COVID-19 Program for Economic Growth, PCPEG. These comprise an agenda to 1. Aggressively mobilize domestic revenue, 2. Streamline and rationalize expenditures, 3. Boost local productive capacity, 4. Promote and diversify exports, 5. Protect the poor and vulnerable, 6. Expand digital and climate responsive fiscal infrastructure, and 7. Implement structural and public sector reforms. To achieve these, there are 3 critical imperatives: successfully negotiating a strong IMF program, coordinating an equitable debt operations program, and applicant green investments. This will enable us to generate substantial revenue, create needed fiscal space for the provision of essential public services, and facilitate the implementation of the PCPEG program. Directly support our roads and digitalization agenda. Public sector institutions that rely on imports, either for inputs or consumption, by 50%, and would work with the Ghana Audit Service and Internal Audit Agency to ensure compliance. support the aggressive production of strategic substitutes, including the list disclosed at the President's last address to the nation, support large-scale agriculture and agribusiness interventions through the Development Bank of Ghana and ADB Bank, introduce policies for the protection and incubation of newly formed domestic industries to allow them to make the goods produced here competitive for local consumption and also to promote exports or, among others, expand our productive capacity in the rail sector of the economy and actively encourage the consumption of locally produced rice, poultry, vegetable oil, and fruit juice, ceramic tiles, among others. To pursue efficiency in government expenditures will, among others, implement the government directives on expenditure measures, integrate procurement approval process with GIFMIS to ensure that projects approved are aligned with budget allocation, review key government programs to reflect relevance, promote efficiency, and ensure that value for money is achieved in all sectors, including OGM, and review the efficiency of statutory funds. To implement structural and public sector reforms will, among others, impose a debt limit on non-concessional financing, undertake major structural reforms in the public sector by reviewing the operations of 36 state-owned enterprises, 8 special purpose vehicles, 90 joint venture companies, 38 regulatory institutions, 68 statutory bodies, and 6 subvented organizations. Enforce compliance with legal and regulatory framework on foreign exchange, initiate measures to overhaul the tax structure in the extractive industry, expand the gold purchase program by the Bank of Ghana to support foreign exchange reserve accumulation, promote an LBMA certified gold refinery in Ghana, and promote local currency stability. To safeguard social protection programs will, among others, expand social protection programs such as LEAP, school feeding, and NHIS for the vulnerable and so excluded. Mr. Speaker, last year, I presented our plan to get us back to pre-pandemic macro stability and growth levels. More importantly, I shared the President's strategy to improve the living standards of Ghanaians and address our central challenge, unemployment. The strategy was anchored on building a sustainable entrepreneurial nation through fiscal consolidation and job creation. I'm happy to report that we have piloted the Youth Start program and launched the district-level program. Mr. Speaker, we now have the commitment of our banks and development partners and are confident that the 10 billion Ghana CD program with 1 million jobs will be achieved in the next 3 years. We are now embarking on a journey to fundamentally reposition our economy with the post-COVID-19 program for economic growth, PCPE, to be supported by the IMF, the World Bank, and other friendly sovereigns and the private sector, both domestic and international. As our blueprint, we are mindful that it will require broad-based contributions and sacrifices. There will be costs to the fiscal adjustment that we intend to make in the coming years to sustain our stability, recovery, and eventual transformation. My pledge to this House, Mr. Speaker, is that there will be fiscal discipline, that every peso that we ask the Ghanaian people and businesses operating in Ghana to contribute will be spent well. The challenges we face are daunting, but we must not lose sight of the greatest strength of being Ghanaian: resilience, entrepreneurial zeal, faith, courage, solidarity, and hope. I therefore ask all of us to play a constructive role in getting our nation fully back on track. Ours is a country with real prospects and the challenges notwithstanding. Ghana will rise again, and my faith is premised on the fact that a lot has achieved, especially over the course of the Fourth Republic, and our policy as outlined in this budget to reset the economy, if supported, would ensure that, indeed, we have not wasted the current global crisis but use it to make our economy stronger and the progress and prosperity of our people even more assured. Global economic developments and outlook. Economic growth and inflation. Mr. Speaker, the global environment is fragile and the outlook remains uncertain. Global economic activity in 2022 has slowed down more broadly and sharply than anticipated. Economic growth in emerging markets and developing economies is expected to slow down from 6.7% in 2021 to 3.7% in 2022, with a similar pattern expected in 2023. In sub-Saharan Africa, growth is expected to slow down to 3.6% in 2022 and 3.7% in 2023 from 4.7% in 2021 due to low investments and a worsening trade balance. Overall, global inflation has risen, driven largely by increases in energy and food prices. Inflation in emerging and developing economies has also risen from an average 5.9% in 2021 to 9.9% in 2022. The war in Ukraine has further heightened inflationary pressures. The exchange rates across the major international currencies depreciated rapidly by the end of the third quarter of 2022. As of 23rd November 2, the Ghana cedi depreciated cumulatively by 54.2% against the US dollar. Similarly, the Ghana cedi depreciated cumulatively by 48.5% against the British pound. Mr. Speaker, I now present to this august House the provisional macroeconomic performance for the first 3 quarters of 2022 based on available data for the period. To better assess the macroeconomic development for the first 3 quarters of the year, permit me to restate the macroeconomic targets set for 2022 as presented in the 2022 Mid-Year Fiscal Policy Review. Overall GDP growth of 3.7%, non-oil real GDP growth of 4.3%, and inflation of 28.5%, overall fiscal deficit of 6.6% of GDP, primary surplus of 0.4% of GDP, and gross international reserves sufficient to cover at least 3.5 months of imports of goods and services. Mr. Speaker, data on the performance of the economy at the end of the third quarter highlights the continuous adverse impact of the challenging global and domestic environment on the economy. As I indicated earlier, these developments have manifested through rapid exchange rate depreciation, high inflation, unsustainable debt burden, fiscal stress, and external sector shocks, among others, despite the monetary and fiscal policy interventions that were deployed in the first 3 quarters of the year. Mr. Speaker, the economic performance for the first 3 quarters of the year is summarized as follows. Mr. Speaker, provisional GDP data from Ghana Statistical Service published in September 2022 indicate that overall real GDP for the first half of 2022 recorded an average year-on-year growth of 3.4% in Q1 2022 and 4.8% in Q2 2022 respectively. Non-oil GDP expanded by 4.1% and 6.2% in the first and second quarters in 2022 respectively. The latest data indicates that headline inflation accelerated to 40.4% in October 2022 from 37.2% in September and 33.9% in August. The rise in October inflation was broad-based, driven by both food and non-food prices. The monetary policy rate has increased by 1,000 basis points from 14.5% to 24.5% since the beginning of the year, as the central bank deployed its monetary policy tools to anchor inflation expectations. Developments on the money market broadly showed rising interest rates across the yield curve. For example, the discount rate on the 91-day instrument has increased to 32.5% as of today from 12.5% in December 2021. The public debt to GDP ratio stood at 75.9% at the end of September 2022, up from 76.7% at the end of December 2021. Gross international reserves stood at $6.591 billion, equivalent to 2.9 months of import cover at the end of September 2022, from a stock position of $9.7 billion, equivalent to 4.3 months import cover at the end of December 2022. Fiscal developments. Mr. Speaker, the 2022 mid-year fiscal policy review revised the 2022 fiscal framework against the backdrop of unfavorable global and domestic developments. The fiscal deficit targets was revised to 6.6% of GDP, down from the 7.4% set in the 2022 budget. Similarly, the primary balance target was revised upwards to a surplus of 0.4% of GDP from a surplus of 0.1%. Lack of revisions in GDP projections, adjustment in the expected yield from the 2022 revenue measures, adjustment to reflect the 30% discretionary expenditure cuts, adjustment in interest rates, and adjustment in allocation for compensation of employees to incorporate a 15% cost of living allowance, adjustment in exchange rate on account of higher depreciation, and adjustment to the benchmark crude oil price. Mr. Speaker, provisional data on government fiscal operations for January to September 2022 shows a shortfall in revenue performance and a faster execution of expenditures. This resulted in an overall budget deficit of $41.7 billion, 7% of GDP, against a program deficit target of $36.7 billion, 6.2% of GDP. The corresponding primary balance for the period was a deficit of $9.6 billion, or 1.6% of GDP, against a deficit target of $5.8 billion, cedis 1% of GDP. Mr. Speaker, total revenue and grants amounted to $65.4 billion, 11% of GDP, compared with a target of $67.3 billion, 11.4% of GDP, and the $49.1 billion, 10.7% of GDP recorded in the corresponding period in 2021. The outturn for total revenue and grants represents a shortfall of 2.8% compared to the period's target and year-on-year growth of 33.2%. The shortfall in revenue stemmed from the less robust performance recorded in all the revenue handles for the period. Mr. Speaker, domestic revenue for the period amounted to $64.6 billion, 10.9% of GDP, falling below the target of $66.5 billion, 11.2% of GDP, by 2.9%. The outturn, however, represents a year-on-year growth of 34% and constituted 98.8% of revenue and grants. Mr. Speaker, total expenditure including arrears, clearance, and discrepancies for the period amounted to $109.4 billion, 18.5% of GDP, above the target of $103.9 billion, 17.6% of GDP, by 5.2%. Compensation of employees amounted to $27.2 billion Ghana cedis, 4.6% of GDP, 2.9% below the budgetary provision of $27.9 billion, 4.7% of GDP. The wage bill constituted 91.3% of the total compensation and amounted to $24.7 billion. Interest payments for the period amounted to $32.1 million, 5.4% of GDP, against a target of $30.9 billion, 5.2% of GDP, reflecting the higher cost of borrowing and the adverse impact of the currency depreciation on external interest. Domestic interest payments constituted 78% of total interest payments for the period. Mr. Speaker, the fiscal operations for the period resulted in an overall budget deficit of 44 billion Ghana cedis, 7.4% of GDP, against a target of 36.7 billion, 6.2% of GDP. The corresponding primary balance for the period was a deficit of 11.9 billion, 2% of GDP, against a deficit target of 5.7 billion, 1% of GDP. The fiscal deficit for the period was financed mainly from domestic sources, amounting to 37.5 billion, 6.3% of GDP, accounting for 85.2% of the total financing. Foreign financing for the period amounted to 6.5 billion, 1.1% of GDP, and accounted for the remaining 14.8% of the financing. Public debt developments, January to September 2022. Mr. Speaker, provisional debt data as at end September 2022 shows a significant increase in Ghana's public debt, largely due to exogenous factors. The end September 2022 provisional figures indicate that total gross public debt stood at 467.4 billion Ghana cedis, 48.9 billion US dollars, representing approximately 75.9% of GDP. The domestic debt component is 195.7 billion Ghana cedis, which is 31.8% of GDP, whilst external is 271.7 billion Ghana cedis, representing 44.15% of GDP. The increase in the domestic debt is largely on account of rising interest costs. Domestic debt as a share of total public debts reduced from 51.6% in 2021 to 41.9% as at end September 2022. Mr. Speaker, the external debt as a percentage of the total debt stock is 58.1% as end September 2022. The sharp growth in the external debt stock is largely driven by the depreciation of the local currency. The depreciation of the Ghana cedi added 93.9 billion to the external debt stock. Overall debt accumulation increased from 20.7% in 2021 to 32% as at end September 2022, reflecting the impact of the depreciation of the Ghana cedi on the external debt side. Mr. Speaker, the external sector performance in the outlook will depend largely on the quick resolution of the Russian-Ukraine war and the outcome of recession fears in advanced economies. The thrust of the stream of the external sector will focus on rebuilding external buffers, enough to cover at least 3.5 months of imports of goods and services, cushion the economy against adverse external shocks. This will be underpinned by, among others, bilateral support and strong remittance inflows. Mr. Speaker, the Bank of Ghana will continue to monitor inflation development and respond appropriately to contain price pressures. Monetary policy will focus on using the monetary policy rate to, among others, contain inflation pressures. Since August 2022, the Bank of Ghana has successfully been working with the mining firms, international oil companies, and their bankers to purchase all foreign exchange arising from the voluntary repatriation. Update on Ghana's engagement with the fund for a fund-supported program. Mr. Speaker, since government announced its engagement with the International Monetary Fund for a supported program on 1st July 2022, we have made substantial progress. The fund assured government of its strong commitment and support in these difficult times. Mr. Speaker, government and the IMF agreed on program objectives, a preliminary fiscal adjustment path, debt strategy, and financing required for the program to be in line with the government's post-COVID-19 program for economic growth. The PCPEC is government's blueprint to restore macroeconomic stability, promote debt sustainability, sustain economic recovery, and support structural reforms. Mr. Speaker, guided by the medium-term policy objectives, the following macroeconomic targets are set for the medium term 2023 to 2026. Overall real GDP growth at an average rate of 4.3%, non-oil average growth of 4%, inflation back to within the target band of 8 plus or minus 2%, and a primary balance on commitment basis to average 0.8% of GDP in 2023 to 2026, and gross international reserves to cover at least 4 months of imports. Mr. Speaker, based on the overall macroeconomic objectives and the medium-term targets, the following macroeconomic targets are set for the 2023 fiscal year. Overall, real GDP growth of 2.8%, non-oil growth of 3%, and December inflation rate of 18.9%, primary balance on commitment basis of 0.7%, and gross international reserves to cover not less than 3.3 months of imports. Mr. Speaker, on resource mobilization for 2023, total revenue and grants is projected at 143.9 billion Ghana cedis, 18% of GDP, and is underpinned by permanent revenue measures, largely tax revenue measures, amounting to 1.35% of GDP as outlined in the revenue measures. Mr. Speaker, total expenditure, including clearance of arrears, is projected at 205.4 billion or 25.6% of GDP. This estimate shows a contraction of 0.3 percentage points of GDP in primary expenditures, commitment basis that is, compared to the projected outturn in 2022, and a demonstration of government's resolve to consolidate its public finances. Mr. Speaker, the following projections underpin the resource allocation for 2023. Compensation of employees is projected at 44.9 billion, 5.6% of GDP. Use of goods and services also projected at 8 billion, 1% of GDP. Interest payments is projected at 52.6 billion, 6.6% of GDP. Grants and other government units is estimated at 30.1 billion, 3.8% of GDP. Capital expenditure is projected at 27.7 billion, 3.5% of GDP. Mr. Speaker, other expenditures mainly comprising energy sector levies, transfers, and energy sector payment shortfalls is estimated at 26.7 billion Ghana cedis. Mr. Speaker, based on the estimates for the total revenue and grants and total expenditures, including arrears clearance, the overall budget balance to be financed is a fiscal deficit of 1.5 billion, equivalent to 7.7% of GDP. The corresponding primary balance, the deficit of 8.9 billion, equivalent to 1.1% of GDP. Mr. Speaker, I wish to notify you that budget items such as interest payments, amortization, and financing will be adjusted accordingly once government's debt management strategy and financing to be provided by international partners in the context of the fund-supported program have been finalized. Revenue measures. Mr. Speaker, government has consistently indicated its intention to improve the revenue collection effort by leveraging technology to enhance tax administration, identify and register taxable persons, and improve tax compliance. Mr. Speaker, government has received several proposals for review of the electronic transfer levy and is working closely with all stakeholders to evaluate the impact of the levy in order to decide on the next line of action, which would include revision of the various exclusions. As a first step, however, the headline rate will be reduced to 1% of the transaction value alongside the removal of the daily threshold. To this end, the income tax regime will undergo reforms to, among others, review the upper limits for vehicle benefits and introduce an additional income tax bracket of 35%. Mr. Speaker, on expenditure measures will also be pursued to support the fiscal consolidation process. In this regard, it is proposed that government will reduce the threshold on earmark funds from the current 25% of tax revenue to 17.5% of tax revenue, migrate all earmark funds onto the GIFMIS platform, and ensure they use the GIFMIS platform to process all their revenue and expenditure transactions, continue the 30% cut in the salaries of the President, Vice President, Ministers, Deputy Ministers, MMDCEs, and political office holders, including those of state-owned enterprises, whilst also ensuring efficiency at the OGM. Also want to place a cap on salary adjustment of SOEs to be lower than negotiated base pay increases on single spine salary structure for each year. Fiscal contingency planning. Mr. Speaker, given the uncertainties about the macroeconomic environment, government stands ready to deploy additional tools if fiscal outturns require further interventions. On the revenue side, some of the measures that we identify for the medium-term revenue strategy being designed by government and in the context of the fund program could be implemented early on. On the spending side, MDA's budget allocations for goods and services or domestic CapEx will be strictly controlled by the quarterly budget allotment system. Mr. Speaker, the present economic challenges have heightened the need to transform our economy through a renewed focus on boosting local capacity for increased export promotion to expand job creation while protecting the vulnerable. Government is therefore taking active steps to address the impact of these economic shocks on Ghanaians through the 7-point agenda to restore macroeconomic stability and accelerate our economic transformation as articulated in the post-COVID-19 program for economic growth. Mr. Speaker, on developing local capacity for production, as I've already indicated, Ghana's heavy dependence on imports places tremendous pressures on the city and unfavorable balance of payments position. On average, Ghana's imports bill exceeds $10 billion annually and is accounted for by a diverse range of items that include iron, steel, aluminium, sugar, rice, fish, poultry, palm, oil, cement, fertilizer, pharmaceuticals, fruit juices, and even toilet roll and toothpicks. We currently have the capacity as a country to locally produce items that account for about 45% of the value of our annual imports. These include rice, fish, sugar, poultry, cement, pharmaceuticals, jute bar, computers, etc. To this end, government will target these products for import for export promotion by supporting the private sector through partnerships with existing and prospective businesses to expand, rehabilitate, and establish manufacturing plants targeted at producing these selected items. Mr. Speaker, the Ghana Cares Obatampa program. Mr. Speaker, it has been 2 years since the launch of the Ghana Cares program to mitigate the severe impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the economy. Significant achievement has been made with the implementation of agreed activities despite the current macroeconomic challenges. Mr. Speaker, the high food prices and pressures on the local currency validates the current focus of the Ghana Cares program to bolster productive and export capacity of the private sector. To this end, an economic enclave project will focus on providing support for the cultivation of up to 110,000 acres of land in the Greater Accra, Ashanti, Central, Savannah, and OT regions are being pursued. Mr. Speaker, this initiative, which seeks to expand our production and productivity in rice, tomato, maize, vegetables, and poultry, is being led and coordinated by the Millennium Development Authority, in collaboration with other government institutions such as the Ministries of Food and Agriculture, Energy, the Ghana Irrigation Development Authority, 48 Engineers Regiment of the Ghana Armed Forces under the Ministry of Defense, the National Entrepreneurial Innovation Program, and the National Service Secretariat and Ghana Enterprises Agency. Mr. Speaker, consistent with the private sector-led approach, the program will engage interested private sector actors to expand an agricultural production and processing in the Asuchare Chopoli Economic Enclave area based on a partnership framework. The same approach will be adopted for the land secured in the Ashanti Central, Savannah, and OT region to reach the 110,000 acres. Mr. Speaker, we have also initiated discussions with the Graphic Communications Group Limited to explore the feasibility of producing paper locally using the byproducts of the cultivated rice in the economic enclave at St0rms as raw material. It is envisaged that the imports of paper will be replaced and more jobs created. Mr. Speaker, in addition to the enclave project, Ghana Cares program in 2023 will continue to offer catalytic support in the following targeted areas. To this end, the program will work with Development Bank of Ghana to provide funding to interested and targeted farmers, support the Ministry of Food and Agriculture to adopt and deploy the farmer registration database with the farmer input subsidy programs to enhance efficiency, support the Ministry of Communication and Digitalization to establish a continental tech hub to improve knowledge in technology and innovation by the youth in collaboration with the University of Ghana, ensure the operationalization of the foundry under a sustainable private sector management framework, provide interest rate subsidies and direct financing, including supporting prioritized sectors in the rural economy through the ARB Apex Bank and its network of banks as agreed under the AFDB supported post-COVID skills and productivity enhancement project. You start. Mr. Speaker, in fulfillment of our pledge of building an entrepreneurial nation, the implementation of the Youth Start program began this year. The program was successfully piloted with 70 beneficiaries and an amount of 1.98 million was disbursed to support youth-led below the age of 40 years SMEs in poultry, agro-processing, ICT, textiles, and food processing sectors. Government has successfully signed an MOU with the Ghana Association of Bankers and 11 other commercial banks for the implementation of the commercial component of the program. Mr. Speaker, a launch for the District Entrepreneurship Program, DEP, component of the program was held on 14 November 2022 and is expected that the launch of the commercial component of the program will occur by the end of this year to enable qualified beneficiaries access support. Mr. Speaker, the One District, One Factory initiative continued to make remarkable progress in 2022. To date, a total of 296 1D1 web projects are at various stages of implementation, out of which 126 are currently operational. 143 are under construction and 27 are pipeline projects. In 2023, government would intensify support to existing and new manufacturing enterprises with technical assistance, credit facilitation, and access to electricity and other infrastructure. Automotive Assembly Program. Mr. Speaker, in addition to the Automotive Assembly Program, government has developed a new components manufacturing policy which seeks to support the local production and supply of components and spare parts for the automotive industry. Ministry of Trade and Industry will launch and commence implementation of the policy in 2023, which is expected to expand job creation. Mr. Speaker, the recent global crisis has severely disrupted inorganic fertilizer supply chains. This has resulted in sharp increases in prices and making it difficult for farmers to access the commodity and thus threatening food security. The Ministry of Food and Agriculture is intensifying efforts to promote the local production and use of organic fertilizers. Further to this, under the subsidy program, the ministry has increased the quota for organic fertilizer suppliers to cover the shortfall in supply of inorganic fertilizers. Additionally, government is facilitating the establishment and the expansion of local organic fertilizer production plants with support from Exim Bank. African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Mr. Speaker, we will pursue strategically opportunities that ensure that we take full advantage of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, AFCFTA, as part of efforts to pursue an export-led economic recovery. The Ministry of Trade and Industry is working with over 200 Ghanaian companies to facilitate their entry into the African market, including about 70 1D1F companies. Additionally, the AFCFTA Guided Trade Initiative has been launched to start commercially meaningful trade. The products identified for the initiative include batteries, tea, coffee, ceramic tiles, processed meat products, cornstarch, sugar, and pasta, amongst others, in line with the AFCFTA focus on value chain development. Mr. Speaker, the Ghana Export Promotion Authority will enhance its coordination role by facilitating support for sector stakeholders. Export trade houses will be established in selected markets to promote made in Ghana products brands, including the completion of the first ETH in Kenya. Additionally, opportunities will be created for local Ghanaian businesses and investors to invest in export products, transformation and value addition at the district level in partnership with the Ministry of Local Government and Rural Development. The Development Bank of Ghana. Mr. Speaker, government through the Development Bank of Ghana has established 500 million Ghana Cedi Special Credit Program, the DBG Emergency Economic Program, DEEP, to support businesses in agribusiness value chain over the next 5 years. The priority sectors are poultry, rice and cereals, pharmaceutical manufacturing, tourism, textiles and garments for investments to help build economic resilience. Mr. Speaker, to support SMEs with equity funding, DBG is also in the process of establishing a private equity fund with an initial capitalization of 30 million Ghana cedis or 400 million, 30 million US dollars or 400 million Ghana cedis. DBG has fully onboarded 4 participating financial institutions and will engage other financial institutions to expand its loan channels. A total of 7 loans amounting to 245 million was to SMEs, saving over 1,000 jobs. DBG has partnered with a PFI to build a digital lending platform to shorten the processing time for lending to SMEs and increase its ability to reach a lot more businesses across the country. Mr. Speaker, the National Insurance Commission is spearheading the development of agricultural insurance for farmers through the Ghana Agriculture Insurance Pool. GAIP provides traditional agriculture insurance and index-based weather insurance products to commercial farmers and smallholder farmers. An estimated $400 million in agriculture insurance will be extended to eligible farmers in 2023. Mr. Speaker, as part of efforts to ensure power is affordable for industrial, commercial, and residential use, government has substantially completed a renegotiation and restructuring exercise of power purchase agreement with 6 operational independent power producers, namely Car Power, Power, Early Power, Twin City Energy, AXA Energy, and Senate Energy. Government, of course, is looking for the resources to fund these agreements. Government has also pursued cost-cutting and green initiatives, including conversion to a tolling model, refinancing of expensive debt, profiling of tariffs, and switching power plants from imported liquid fuel to finance locally produced natural gas as a primary resource. On connectivity to the national grid, a total of 157 communities were linked to the national grid as of September 2022. The Ministry of Energy will further connect an additional 400 towns, 4 Chef 5 and 10 key projects in 2023. Mr. Speaker, substantial progress has been made on coastal fishing ports and landing sites. This has been made in the development of 12 coastal fish landing sites and 2 fishing ports along the coast of Ghana, namely Azim and Diskov in the western region, Mori, Fansimane, Kumfi, Mumford, Winneba, Senyabreku, Gomoafet and Mena in the central region, Teshi, Osu and Jamestown in the greater Accra region, and Keta in the Volta region. Mr. Speaker, overall, the project is about 95% complete and would ensure safe launching and landing of artisanal fishing canoes and promote hygienic environmental conditions. Mr. Speaker, on climate change, Global warming poses major threats to the economies of climate-vulnerable countries like Ghana. According to the Vulnerable 20 Loss and Damage Report, Ghana lost $15.2 billion from 2000 to 2019 to climate change. According to the World Bank Group's new country climate and development report for Ghana, incomes could reduce by up to 40% for poor households by 2050, and a loss of about 1 million jobs if urgent climate actions are not taken. Mr. Speaker, at COP27, the government took the opportunity to leverage its bilateral engagements to expand consultation on debt for nature swaps, as well as increase private sector investment to accelerate our transition to low carbon growth and finance our climate action measures. Mr. Speaker, I can report that Ghana has assumed the presidency from 2022 to 2024 of the Climate Vulnerable Forum and the chair of the Vulnerable 20 Group of Ministers of Finance of Governments. Government will leverage this opportunity to accelerate our climate agenda, which is outlined in Ghana's climate prosperity plans. Social protection. Mr. Speaker, even amidst the current difficulties, we remain committed to implementing Ghana's social protection programs. We will not renege on our responsibilities towards the vulnerable and socially excluded, and the implementation of our various social protection programs will be expanded. Mr. Speaker, the Livelihood Empowerment Against Poverty program, LEAP, has since its inception in 2008 supported extremely poor and vulnerable households, increasing beneficiary coverage from 144,000 in 2015 to 344,000 households, comprising 1.8 million individuals as of September 2022. Government is committed to expanding coverage to all 2.5 million extreme poor individuals as estimated by the Ghana Living Standard Survey by 2024, while improving efficiency through digitalization and assessments. The government will, in 2023, increase the value of the LEAP grant from the average of 41.75 Ghana cedis per household to about 95.19 cedis bi-monthly. Mr. Speaker, the Ghana School Feeding Program, which provides one hot nutritious meal each year for 3.4 million beneficiary pupils in public basic schools as of December 2021, will be sustained and increase budgets
Honorable
to them.
Minister, just a minute. The second Deputy Speaker to take the temporarily. I'll be back soon.
Thank you.